Hey guys, and welcome back to Mad About Skin. In today's video, we are taking a brief departure from the usual content I share here on the channel because there's been some huge and significant updates to sunscreen regulations announced out of the US. Now, I know sunscreen regulation is not the sexiest, it's not the most glamorous and exciting topic to be talking about, but these changes wherever you live, whether it's in the US or anywhere else in the world, are going to have a significant impact on the sunscreens that we buy, the formulations, and how we use them in our skincare routine. So I wanted to pick it all apart, demystify it, break down the science, and share with you first and foremost what these changes are, how they might impact us, whether I think they're from the positive or the negative, and ultimately where it leaves us and some of our favourite sunscreens. So sit back, relax, and let's talk some updated sunscreen regulations. Now, before we get into this, I appreciate that these regulations come out of the FDA, which regulate the US market specifically. So whilst we might not all live in the US, we might be thinking, does this really apply to us? Well, in truth, it does. That's because the US is such a huge market in terms of its purchasing power for skincare. A lot of brands will formulate their products for the US market and then just happen to sell them internationally. That's why any changes that are required by US law will feed through and be reflected in some of our favourite brands that we can get here in Europe, over in Asia, Australasia, wherever you are, this will have an impact. Also, I do always think it's worth looking at what other regulators are doing because ultimately they're the guys that are supposed to protect us, the consumers, for the bad companies, the shady goings on in the business world. And so it's really good to see what countries are doing in terms of protecting us, the consumer, which is kind of what I want all this video to be. I don't want this to be like super detailed because I think when I read the press release and the announcement, I thought, this is like baffling. How is anybody supposed to understand what's actually going on here? So I want to pick it apart, keep it short, simple, and like a one-stop shop so we know what changes are coming. So shall we just cut the waffle and delve straight on in? Now, I don't think any of us are actually surprised that this review has taken place because Congress actually mandated and required a review of the FDA regulations surrounding sunscreens quite a while back, and the FDA have left it to the right last possible minute they could absolutely release this before they did. Now, they've released their preliminary findings and some directional guidelines as to how things are likely to change in the future. This isn't the actual final copy because there'll be some industry consultation and some chance for things to change before the final guidelines are released later on, and of course there'll be a set date for when these have to be adhered to. They haven't actually told us when that's going to happen, but I'm going to be talking around the preliminary findings because I think this gives us a really good steer of how our sunscreens are likely to change and some of the regulations that are going to be tightened up. I think first and foremost, the thing that jumped out of me is there's going to be a restriction on the maximum SPF which can be advertised on a sunscreen product. This will make zero difference to anyone living in Europe, the EU, or in Asia because actually we've already got these restrictions. I think a lot of people think that the FDA are actually leading the charge from the forefront of regulation when it comes to sunscreen, but actually a lot of their decisions they make are quite old. They often come like 10 years after the same decision's been made by other regulators, and this is a really good example of that. I think the EU limited to a maximum of 50 plus the SPF that can be advertised on a sunscreen product around 10 years ago. This is like nothing new, but it's good to see that the FDA are following that. So we're likely to see in the next year all of the sunscreens advertising an SPF of above a 60 plus in their case to be phased out. I actually think this is a huge tick in the box when it comes to the consumer. I'm not sure why they've gone for an SPF of 60 plus rather than an SPF of 50 plus, which tends to be the global standard. Maybe that's just because they want to differentiate the US market from the EU market and so on. Who knows? But I definitely think this is a real tick in the box when it comes to the consumer protection. The reason this matters is because we get a false sense of security from the SPF that we're using. I think the maximum one that I've actually seen on the market was an SPF 250. So people reach for that thinking, honestly, they've got like weeks worth of protection when they're slathering on this super high SPF. In truth, because we perspire, because our clothes rub our SPF off, we're exposed to free radicals and things that can break it down. Actually, you're not getting a whole lot of additional benefit reaching for an SPF of 250 as what you are over an SPF 50 plus. But in our minds, we think we're getting a lot more protection. So we might be a little bit more foolhardy. We might be less cautious when it comes to our sun exposure. And so actually, I think capping it at an SPF of 50 plus or 60 plus, whichever country you live in, I think is a good thing because actually you're not getting a whole lot of extra additional benefit beyond that SPF value. When you reach for your 100s, your 250s, it just doesn't exist. So I really think this is a step forward in terms of consumer protection. The second thing that's going to change, again, I think is a huge step forward, and that is giving a minimum requirement for classifying a product as a broad spectrum SPF. There are two types of rays that the products that we reach for are supposed to protect against: UVB radiation and UVA radiation. Previously, we thought the UVB radiation was the one that did the most damage in terms of cellular structure and potential cancers down the line, but actually there's a whole suite of new scientific evidence and data that shows that UVA radiation can be just as damaging for our cells and can lead to cancers as well. well. So we're often seeing a lot of brands and regulators really pushing forward the broad spectrum label, which means that the product will cover against both forms of radiation. It just kind of got you covered in one single product. There is no international legal definition of what constitutes a broad spectrum sunscreen, and so a lot of regulators and individual territories have come up with their own guidance as what can be called a broad spectrum sun protection product and what can't. It ranges from here in the UK, where we have quite a low minimum requirement for UVA protection in order for a product to be classed as broad spectrum, through to Australia and New Zealand, which have some of the tightest regulations in the world. You really have to be offering a lot of UVA protection in order to call your product a broad spectrum product over in Australia. The US had no minimum requirement, and that's going to change with these regulations, which I think is a huge step forward. Whilst they haven't released the figures, they've given a guidelines which actually is in excess of what a lot of territories already require. So I think this is a great step forward internationally. We'll see a lot more brands upping their game when it comes to providing that UVA protection alongside the UVB protection, and really calling a product broad spectrum to just protect our skin no matter what rays are hitting it. I think this is a huge step forward for the consumer, and I really look forward to these coming in. They are going to be voluntary, but they are going to be regulating what products can and can't be classed as broad spectrum. So still need to do your due diligence when it comes to choosing whatever sun care product you do, but I do just think it gives an extra layer of protection for us, the consumer. Now, thirdly, and I think this is where it's going to become a little bit disappointing, I think a lot of people were hoping that the US regulators would change tack and allow a lot more ingredients to be classified as UV filters. Now, disappointingly, the FDA have decided that they're not going to be expanding the total number of ingredients that they're willing to classify as safe UV filters, which means that brands don't have to do additional testing before they can use these ingredients in their sun care products. I think this is a real shame. There are so many amazing UV filters out there, newer generation ones that feel lighter on the skin, give better broad spectrum protection, and also just make the products want to be used. I always think when it comes to sun cream, there is no point it sitting in the bottle. The best sunscreens are the ones that you will use every single day. Those are the lightweight, the elegant feeling ones. A lot of people say that the traditional US sunscreens are quite clunky to use, they're quite sticky, they're greasy, they're not that elegant. That's because the FDA don't allow a whole lot of filters to be used to be classified as safe for use in sunscreens, which is why it's such a restrictive market. I think this is so backwards in terms of regulation, because there's so many new generation filters on the market that the US consumer is missing out on by the FDA not looking into them and actually being a bit more progressive in the way that they view these filters. That's just my opinion, but you know what? I think when it boils down to it, I was expecting a lot more movement in this, and I know a lot of consumers were. I know so many of you guys that watch this channel from the US actually use European sunscreens and import them from Europe because you prefer the feel, the elegance, and how they perform on the skin. And I really thought that this was an opportunity for the FDA to update everything and really move things forward. I think it's not going to change anything in a meaningful way, and who knows what's coming down the line, but I think this is a real, missed opportunity to actually update things and make sure that the US sunscreen manufacturers and market is ahead of the curve, not sitting behind and providing substandard in terms of the texture products to consumers. I think this is a little bit of a shame, but that's just my personal views. Sound off in the comment section below if you disagree. Now, in summary, what do I think? I think there's been some steps forward. I think it's great that we're going to have a definition of what constitutes broad spectrum sun protection. I think it's great that they're capping the amount of SPF claims on a bottle. I think these are both really consumer friendly and a step in the right direction. I'm disappointed that they're not including more filters in the safe to use in sunscreens category. A lot of people will be saying, oh, well, the FDA are really tight on their ingredients. That's great because that's protecting us, the consumer. I actually think this is a little bit misguided because in truth, the regulations that have been in place for decades haven't protected us, the consumer. You look at the benzene sunscreen scandal. These regulations weren't protecting us against that common carcinogen being found in a lot of US sunscreens. And so the idea that being a little bit more cautious and backward is somehow protecting the consumer more, I personally don't think is the case. And I think a lot of the scandals which have come out in the past 10 years have demonstrated that, and I hope there would be a little bit move forward. In truth, I'm going to be sticking to my European sunscreens and some of my favourite Korean sunscreens. I'll leave a link to some of my favourite European sunscreens in a video I did up there. Definitely worth checking out because I think there's so many great options. There are still some really good North American US sunscreens to be found on the market, and I will do a video if you guys like. Sound off in the comment section below if you want a video on the best US sunscreens I've been able to find. There are some really good ones out there, but I think they're falling behind the curve. I don't think the textures, the feel on the skin are really delivering what we now expect as consumers. And when it comes to wearing your sunscreen day in, day out, you want it to feel gorgeous on the skin. You want that nice, elegant feel. And I just don't think you can always get that with US sunscreens. I would love to know your favorite recommendations, so sound off. And while you're down there, this video took a lot of research and pulling together, so make sure you give this video a big thumbs up and a like if you want to support me and the channel. Wherever you are in the world, guys, stay safe, stay well, and love your skin. Take care. Bye.